Welcome, everyone, to this week's very special Cat's Eye on the Future. This episode, episode 3 of a 4-part series on heathen ritual and traditions, was part of a long conversation that took place over about 3 hours. It was intended originally to be part 2 of a 2-part series, but it just sort of took on a life of its own. Now, I've had some confusion from my listeners, and I want to clarify. You can find part 1 of this series, which is Heathen Ritual Part 1, the historical background, in the archives at Time Monk Radio Network. And its number is Time Monk Radio Network, that's TMRN, that it's DC4101. So it's 4101 you want for part 1 of this series. That was recorded all on its own, and that show is like one evening's talk on the historical background. The next 3 shows are broken up of really what is one gigantically long interview, which I thought just did better as 3 shows rather than one really long session. You can find part 2, which is the start of this particular conversation, also in the archives at Time Monk Radio Network, DCS4111. So it's show number 4111. It's going to be part 2, and it deals with tools and other physical objects and things that you can make and use for your heathen ritual. Tonight's show is a little bit shorter because that was just how the long conversation broke up. I wanted to keep some coherence of topic, and that resulted in 2 shows slightly longer than an hour, and 1 show that was really more about 35 minutes or so. But it reads better, it listens better, and they just work better this way. So that's why we're doing the shorter broadcast tonight. The topics of tonight's shows include things like ritual garb, a little bit of review of historical background again, the origins of the symbol, and some of the other things that you may or may not choose to do in ritual, and just a variety of those topics. I think on that note, I'll just let Kavildoffer talk for himself, but remember, this is part 3. You can find parts 1 and 2 back in the archives, and part 4 will be broadcast in the next week or 2. I really want to thank all my listeners for joining in. I'm sorry about the confusion we've had, but I look forward to hearing your feedback on these shows, and I think particularly for heathens and pagans, you're really going to find this interesting, although I have to say that a lot of the material in these particular 4 shows can also be used in just about any religious tradition because it involves things like the creation of rituals, sacred spaces, guarding and warding, protection, prayer, and all the things that kind of go with a religious tradition. In any case, I'm going to go for now, and let's just get started with part 3. And we brought this up in other shows. The question that people get asked so many times practicing Germanic religions was simply the misuse of it by some groups in the past, and sadly also in the present.
Okay, but yeah, back to the original topic.
Yep.
Something else that comes up pretty frequently is the matter of ritual clothing. Now, I mentioned earlier the apparent association of the long robe with priestly function, at least in the iconography. We have a few references to color being important, in particular red. It's mentioned in a couple of the sagas. There is this mention of wearing red trousers. The phrase used in one instance is moss red, which I used to think was suggesting a sort of reddish brown, but then I learned more about natural dyeing, and one can get some spectacularly brilliant glowing reds out of lichen found in Northern Europe. It's hard to find enough of that lichen to dye a garment red, so this would have been something special, something that would have required someone wandering around in the wilderness quite a while. But red is the primary color of magic and spiritual might in general. If you're looking for a color for Germanic ritual usage, and you can't really think of what to use, just go with red. White was also occasionally used. You get white mentioned as a holy color fairly frequently. Blue, dark blue, was specifically associated with death, with killing, with mourning, and with Odin. So you would wear it when you were in a killing mood, and by that the saga means literally getting ready to go whack someone. You wear a blue cloak and people could see you coming, I guess. Something like that. But it was used for wall hangings during times of mourning. It was the most popular burial color. So that, it wouldn't be something that you would use generally. You would want to think about why you were doing it. Now, one of the controversies, I suppose, that's been going around for a few years, in fact, that's been going around at least since the 1980s, is the question of whether it's better to wear some form of historical garb, to wear, what modern Christians or whatever would go into church with, your best everyday type clothes, or whether, it's just grand to worship in jeans and a t-shirt. And I think my personal opinion is that all three are valid. They're saying and doing different things. The main reason for wearing historical garb is a sense of, if you like, ritual separateness. You're saying that this ritual is happening within weird, that it's happening in a timeless manner, when the weird of one's forebears is united with the immediate space in modern time. Many people find that wearing historical garb helps them get into the right mental space, the right spiritual space, makes it easier for them to feel that they're with the gods and their forebears. The next approach, and this was advocated more by Edward and Jim back in the day, was the logic that okay, you're inviting the gods over. You should dress nicely to honor them, and by and large, with a few exceptions, such as the bird-horned helmet and masks and a few other things, but probably the average Viking Age person holding their home winter nights or Yule might well have dressed in the very best they had, but wouldn't really have gone out of their way to dress in an archaic fashion. They would have dressed as modern Christians going to church mostly do, just to show respect, show that it's a special occasion. But they wouldn't have gone out of their way to do anything really unusual. And then there is the jeans and t-shirts approach, which is basically expressing a slightly different but still just as valid and important relationship with the gods, which is, this is the way I would dress having family, friends, and buddies over. I'm dressing like this to show the gods that I am comfortable with them, that they're my good friends, and we are hopefully relaxed together. It also strengthens the understanding that religion isn't something you do once a month in the VA or wherever you hold your rituals. It's something that's part of life in the Middle-Garth all the time. So all three approaches are valid. All three have benefits. And it's purely a matter of personal taste, in my opinion. I suspect that it was fairly varied in the Viking Age as well.
I've noticed that even people that wear t-shirts, and I do this occasionally, still tend to wear something special. Maybe the t-shirt says Odin or Freya on it, or they have a special earring or a necklace or something that is still sort of indicating that they're stepping from totally every day into something different.
Yeah, it's personal opinion. I think even the most committed jeans and t-shirts people, they're still going to wear their hammer or whatever, although they would likely be wearing that in the normal way of things as one does. But yeah, I personally like to make a bit more of a production out of rituals. I personally like the historical garb, lots of poetry, various and sundry things happening, which in fact leads me on to some of the things that can be done in addition to the kind of core ritual. And one of the best place to find other things to spice up your ritual with is folklore practice from the northern countries. And there is a wonderful and wide range of things. For instance, the very common practice of the last sheaf, which is historically the last sheaf of grain in the field at the harvest time, which might be tied with ribbons and left to stand in the field. It might be brought in, dressed up, have other things done with it. There's a lot of versions of it, but it's a nice thing to add in. You might at winter nights get a sheaf of grain, tie it up with ribbons, put it on the harrow, have a special blessing, perhaps calling on Freyr or on putting it out as an offering for Odin and the woad host. That's a very, very common thing to do. At Astara, of course, one has all of the egg customs, and one can do all the usual things one does with eggs, many of which come from heathen Germanic culture originally, most probably. You can put the eggs on the harrow, decorated or otherwise, to bless them, pass them out and let people eat them. It's quite common at some festivals to, again, include apples and have apples passed out while the horn is passed around or while the toast is made, so that everyone can have a share of Heathen's apples. One of my favorite variants of the usual modern horn and blessing bowl is a compromise between what was historical and what is practical now, which is making an appropriate animal out of bread and basically cutting its throat over the bowl, sacrificing it, but then still using the holy liquid from the horn to stand in for the blood.
And I know we talked about it some in a previous show, but what about Germanic rituals and little plays or music or those sorts of things?
Yeah. Ritual drama was apparently a big thing among the Scandinavian Norse, presumably other Germanic people as well, but the most surviving materials and most of the research that has been done is in the Norse materials. And in the previous interview, I mentioned Bertha Philpotts and Terry Gunnell's arguments for the Eddic poems as actually scripts for ritual dramas. We have visual stuff such as the Oseberg Tapestry, which is showing some sort of massive procession with masking and dancing going on. Masking was very common in all sorts of ways, and again, I think we discussed this in a couple of previous interviews. I talked about it particularly as a Yuletide thing. So yes, those are things that were done very commonly as far as we can tell in Scandinavia, aren't done nearly as often as I'd like to see now. I think it's an excellent thing to add in, particularly if you have a moderate to large group with a reasonable number of people who are fairly experienced in Ausatru. It would be a bit more difficult to do it in an introductory sort of way. Although if you've got a good core group, it's often more quickly moving, easier to get the mental and spiritual attention of somebody who doesn't know much about Asatru with a well-done ritual drama than it is with just the horn and the toasts.
What about the use of, say, music or musical instruments, drumming, chanting, that sort of?
Well, I think it's fairly safe to say that they probably did it. Certainly in the Bronze Age, ritual music was a big deal, and we know this because we have the surviving lure horns, and we also have several picture stone procession images showing people marching around with these things, which are like basically their Bronze Age sousaphones. They wrap around your body with a bell going up over your head, more or less. They were pretty loud, and they sound a lot like a trombone or baritone horn. I know because I got to blow on one in the museum in Bergen once. And they were obviously crucial to the Bronze Age. We know that drumming was used for magical purposes. It's not absolutely certain in some of these whether the practice actually came from the Sami shaman drums, because it's most commonly mentioned in the context of the Sather word, and the Sather word was a funny and wiggly word that usually applied to a kind of nasty native form of non-consensual mental control and the induction of insanity, but also could be and I think probably was used for foreign magics that involved a lot of trance work and other things that looked like Sather. Sather in particular was associated with singing. There's a description in one saga of the Sather charm putting people to sleep, and the one person who came out dropping dead, if I recall correctly.
Charming.
There's actually one author that theorized that the identification of some of these closed group gatherings of Sather workers singing these weird songs was an early heathen misunderstanding of Christian ritual music. It was a cute argument, but I think it's totally improbable.
So basically, in most cases, the use of music, singing, chanting is appropriate, but we don't have a lot to come down to us on how they did it.
Exactly. We have some guesses about Norse music. There's a bit of debate about whether the Icelandic Tvísöngur is naturally Norse or whether it was influenced by very early Christian music. We do have Giraldus Cambriensis describing the Norse in northern England, bringing the practice of harmony singing to the Isles. And in fact, the northern English folk traditions of music still involve a form of part singing, which does actually sound rather like the Icelandic Tvísöngur. It's just a smidgen creepy to Western ears, and if you want to hear it, I recommend checking out a group called the Watersons.
Yeah, Yorkshire Harmony is what it is.
Yorkshire Harmony. Grieg was of the strong impression that there was the use of quarter tones, particularly between F and F sharp and B flat and B. And one of the things that I have noticed myself about the 19th century collections of Scandinavian folk music is that quite commonly you'll see the transcription alternating between F, F sharp or B, B flat in the same song, consistently every other usage of the note alternating. And I think it is possible that this could have been an effort to represent quarter tones in a form of musical notation not suited to it.
I've also noticed that listening to YouTube and playing around with some of the Russian sites, I've heard some of the edges in areas like the Ukraine, and which is not actually Russian, but that whole area of the Rus Empire, folk music that sounds amazingly like Yorkshire Harmony. And my hunch was maybe this was remnants, all of the edges, sort of the Norse world, of bits and pieces that came down of that particular type of singing, because it's a little odd to the Western ear. It's just not, but it's not, you can't really say, oh, that's Eastern either. It's just different.
Yeah, it's quite plausible. Again, we can't rule out the possibility that the Edges preserved elements of very, very early Christian harmony.
Yes.
But on the other hand, they could just as well have preserved the elements of the original Norse musical system.
Or kind of a combination of both.
Yeah.
Would make sense.
You have been listening to part 1 of Cat's Eye on the Future. We'll return to the show right after these short messages.
Do you have questions? The cards have answers. If you would like a personal reading with Melodi, just go to my website, melodipsychicreadings.com. That's Melodi with an I, psychicreadings.com, for information, or email me at melodireader@gmail.com. Readings are available using Skype, phone, email, or even in person if you are lucky to live in Ireland. Why not find out what special messages the cards have just for you and book a private reading today?
We now return to part 2 of Cat's Eye on the Future.
Really good sort of topic. The one other thing that I wanted to ask you about before we close was just if you could say a little bit about the use of runes in religious practice and ritual, not just, in terms, because, you walk into, again, if you're a newbie and you walk in, you may see people making various signs and things or painting them. It can be very confusing.
Okay, well, obviously, unless you're just straight out talking to the gods as you talk to a person on a more casual basis, you're probably going to be using runes because, what you're doing a ritual and it's significant speech. So the whole ritual could be seen as a rune, but I think what you're actually talking about is rune staves.
Yes, rune staves. Yes, the squiggles.
Okay, well, I think we can reasonably accept that rune staves, graven and possibly spoken, were an element that was used religiously. In fact, I believe it's maybe the Sparlösa stone, one of the earlier Swedish rune stones, describes the runes as being given by the great gods, and Odin says something fairly similar in Havamal. So there was, for quite relatively early, a sense that verbal magic, at the very least, had a strong religious connotation as well as the purely magical function. Now, did this refer to these staves? We don't know, but we do see individual staves being used in what appears to be a religious context, such as the two stones in Denmark in the transitional period around the 8th century or so, which appear to be memorials to chieftains who brought and were still expected to bring fruitfulness, good harvest, and generally good stuff to their area. I think it's probably done much more today than it was by most people back in the day. But that's perfectly fine. It's a perfectly valid technique to trace the stave, chant it, use it as a focus for building might. Now, one thing that is very hard to sort out quite often in traditional religions of all sorts is where magic ends and religion begins, at least in terms of practice. Now Wicca is basically, ceremonial magic, like with a bit of prayer thrown in terms of actual ritual practice. In the Norse, it's not nearly that clear cut. There's no evidence that anyone went to any great efforts to build up magical power themselves, concentrate it, fire it more or less with the help of the deity, whatever. I don't think you would find anything like that ceremonial or ceremonial-like Wicca practice of, we have the circle, and if you want to go to the bathroom during the ritual, someone must ritually open the circle and cut you out and let you back in. And let me just say here that if I ever again go to a symbol with potty rules, I'm going to be very unhappy, and we'll see a replay of the potty wars at Drit Scare. I'm not making this up. It's in Erbigja Saga. The people who had the Hof made these really elaborate potty rules, which basically said you had to row out to this little offshore island to do your business. And a lot of other people did not consider this such a good thing. And then they fought about it, and then they spilled blood on the land in question, which more or less defiled it anyways.
Right, okay. So that's probably having elaborate rituals for cutting oneself in and out are not necessary when it comes to most
totally, awesomely, completely not necessary.
I mean, I can see how it might be polite to just sort of be quiet about it.
Yeah.
But...
yeah. I mean, if you're at a ritual and for whatever reason you need to leave the room, just sneak out real quietly. Least attention drawn best.
Yeah.
Especially if you've brought your small child and the small child needs to be changed or fed, and is expressing its opinion. It's best to depart as quietly and courteously as you can. Most of the gods have kids themselves; they'll understand.
So basically, you're creating or using an existing sacred space, but it isn't so much of a magical circle that can't be unbroken, or
right.
The way a Wiccan or a ceremonial magic circle.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. If you step out of the circle inappropriately during a ceremonial or Wiccan rite, all sorts of bad things can happen. At the very least, the power gets dissipated, ill-meaning whites can come in, what have you. None of that's the case as far as we can tell in the Norse. It's the powers there, regardless, until and unless you dehallow the space, if you feel the need to dehallow the space. And that's no historical information on that, very much a personal choice, mostly done by people who trained in other magical traditions. But, it's not going to open the door to ill-willing Ettins or whatever to walk in just because you walked out. But
yet, still at the end, we would tend to say something like that Icelandic blessing gave.
Yeah, some sort of formal, it's over now, we're at least stepping down to a lower level of spiritual intensity. It's important to keep some degree of boundary there.
And now a lot of groups I know tend to finish up with a potluck or some sort of symbolic feast. Would that also be traditional?
That is totally traditional, and it's probably our very oldest tradition. We don't know all that much about Stone Age Scandinavian religion, but one of the things we do know is that the communal feast was a big, big deal, and this continued to be the case all the way through.
So you at least want to probably do a version of milk and tea and cookies, or better yet, a small potluck where everybody brings at least some sandwich food and different things.
And also, this is, in my opinion, part of the logic behind, not doing a big ceremonial style, go away everyone and take down the circle, because you want the gods, the ancestors, the whites, to stick around in some degree for the feast. You invited them to the feast, their family, their friends.
So it would be appropriate to take a small amount, say, of food and put it maybe on a platter and put it on the altar?
Absolutely.
And is there any sort of thing before we leave, sort of like a heathen grace or anything that one would say?
Not really as such. It has been the practice in modern times all along to make the sign of the hammer over one's food, and that's derived directly from the scene in Haakon the Good, where Haakon, who picked up, funny habits, joined that weird southern cult when he was in England. He comes back and he's still trying to be a Christian, but he's the king. He's got to lead the ritual, or at least not be obviously offending the gods in front of all of his jarls and warriors. And fortunately, he's got his good friend, the Jarl Sigurður, who's kind of running interference. But at one point, he's supposed to be making the toast to Odin, Freyr, and Njörður for everyone, and instead he takes the horn and signs the cross over it. And his jarls are, "What's that?" And Sigurd's like, "Oh, well, he's just doing as men who trust in their own might and main do in signing the Thor's hammer over the drink." Now, was signing the Thor's hammer really a thing anywhere but Sigurd's quick imagination and swift mouth? Who knows? The context suggests that it was actually a known thing, but I'm hard put to think of other examples of it.
But at least it gives us one.
But it's something we can do, and it's appropriate. You're hallowing the food, you're blessing the food. It's a nice gesture showing that you appreciate the god's contribution to the food being there. It's just it's something I find an appropriate thing to do.
So then, and after the feast, basically, at any point after you get a small plate of food and you've chatted for a while, it's then kind of appropriate for people who can stay, and people who can leave. And
yeah.
It's sort of, well, that sounds, I really want to thank you for going through that, because I think that this is something that a lot of people are going to be really interested in. And again, there's a million different ways to actually pull it off in practicality and versions of what you can do. But this is kind of a great foundational board for walking forward.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one thing that we always have to keep in mind is that, when we talk about Ausatru or heathenry, depending on who you are and what your approach is, we could be talking about anything from the beginning of the Stone Age to folk customs going up into the 20th and even maybe the 21st century. We could be talking about anywhere from northern Norway to North Africa, and all the way over to Finland, all the way over to Russia on the other side. And even in continental Scandinavia during the Viking Age, there were some marked cultural differences, which the Scandinavians themselves were aware of and even made snotty remarks about each other regarding, just as they occasionally do to this day. As Kipling said, there are 59 ways of constructing tribal lays, and while in this particular instance I'm not quite prepared to say that every single one of them is right, because there have been funny modern ideas sneaking in here and there, and some of them have worked splendidly for adoption, just as our ancestors adopted whatever they came across and liked. So some of them maybe aren't so compatible or not such good ideas, but overall there is a huge amount of range for different approaches, different styles. Whether you want to go with strictly single place and time source, or include the entirety of the Germanic past. That's between you and the gods. I'm
reminded of actually a Watterson song that they do. That's an old traditional that is talking about, of course, after the conversion, Christmas is basically the Yule customs, and the line is talking about the French. They shall eat the feathered goose, and we, the English, shall eat the roast.
Okay, that's actually referring to the goose feathers on the arrow fletching, What that's actually saying is, we'll eat the goose and then we'll take the feathers and go shoot the snot out of the French.
Really, on the album it says it's about the dinner, so it probably morphed into being about dinner.
The song is nominally about the dinner, but when that particular line is actually meant to be a more than vaguely threatening play on the imagery.
So it's not only making fun of the other people that share, to some degree, your traditions. It's making fun of their fighting style as well.
That particular line is very aggressive, because if there was English could do to the French, it was shoot them.
Well, I think we'll perhaps do the Battle of Agincourt another time. But I think this has been a really, really great interview. I want to really thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for joining this special episode, which is part 3 of a 4-part talk on heathen ritual, especially the practical aspects. Please join us for our last segment, where we'll talk more about craft and other things that can be used to help make a ritual space and the fellowship of getting to know your kindred a little bit better in our final segment, which will be part 4. Thank you very much for listening this evening. We look forward to seeing you again next time here at Cat's Eye.
You have been listening to Cat's Eye on the Future, the show where we take a look at what's coming up in your world and your future. Join us again next time for another episode of Cat's Eye on the Future.